I'm Noam Chomsky. You're watching Working TV on the cable.
As yet, my researchers and I have found absolutely no indication that the pathogens that are turning up in the gel samples, the cobweb material, have anything whatsoever to do with weather or environmental modification. There seems to be a second program at work here. In January of this year, there was a high-level summit conference. You may not have read about it in the local newspapers or heard about it on the CBC for some reason or other. This was a conference on the changing demographics on this planet, the aging population, and its threat to corporate profits and to defense budgets in particular. We had the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank representatives were there, very high-level people, and they were discussing what in the world are we going to do with the aging population. At least those are the words they used. Other words that have been used in the past are useless eaters. People who become elderly and no longer contribute monetarily to society and become a burden on society in terms of social assistance and especially Medicare. And as that becomes the preponderance in our population, there is a lot of concern among corporations in particular about their bottom line. The eugenics movement got its start in 1907 in the United States when the first eugenics law was passed there. And by 1944, 40,000 so-called insane or feeble-minded people had been forcibly sterilized. Another 22,000 by as recently as 1963. Now in 1920, the Rockefeller Foundation, who became a principal promoter of the population, called for the mass sterilization and elimination of minority populations in the United States. And to head their program, they chose the fascists Ernest Rudin and Franz Kallman. Of course, it was Rockefeller Standard Oil that got together with I.G. Farben during that war. It became virtually the same corporation. It was Farben who made the nerve gas that killed more than 6 million Jewish people. Rudin himself went on to become part of the Nazi state and became president of the Worldwide Eugenics Federation. His sterilization law was adapted by the United States as law in July 1933 as a model with Hitler's signature attached. Kallman went on to head the American Society of Human Genetics, the Human Genome Project you've been hearing so much about recently. If you haven't heard about its Nazi antecedents. That's a $3 billion effort, of course, to map DNA by the year 2003, and they're well on their way. That's going to be pretty nifty because apparently we'll be able to identify genetically caused diseases, go in there and tinker around and eliminate those diseases. What they're not stressing in the news reports is that we'll also be able to identify race-specific diseases so that we can attack specific populations of people with diseases that will only kill them. In the 1950s, the U.S. eugenics movement moved literally into Rockefeller's family offices. Lawrence Rockefeller became head of the New York City Blood Council and then International Blood Banking. These are the eugenics people. 1960s, General William Draper. He supplied credit to the Nazis during World War II, and now he started the Draper Fund. The Vietnam generals we've all heard about, Maxwell Taylor, William Westmoreland, who headed that genocide and dioxin defoliation campaign in Vietnam. They were members of the Population Crisis Committee of the William Draper Fund. In 1964, the former commanding general, U.S. Army Chemical Corps, listed bioweapons favored by the U.S. military. There's a long list. I won't go into it, but let's note brucellosis, influenza, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Congressional investigations in 1977 and 1994 documented 50 years of biowarfare experimentation, as I mentioned earlier. 1969, a man named George Bush, son of the eugenics eugenics advocate and Nazi bankroller Prescott Bush, this is all documented, by the way, chaired a committee urging world population control. Just 1 year later, Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor to President Nixon, issued National Security Memorandum 200 calling for a reduction of the populations of the lesser developed countries, that is the growth rate, by half. By half. He said we have to depopulate 14 countries or the U.S. will face a crisis worse than nuclear war. Kissinger said we can decrease the birth rate or increase the death rate. It's too bad he said we can't use nuclear weapons. It's a little obvious, but we have something even better. In fact, it was Kissinger who took the U.S. biowarfare program underground when Nixon publicly outlawed it and declared the U.S. was getting out of the biowarfare business. Kissinger made sure that program continued. There was another national security advisor to Nixon at the very same time. His name was Roy Ash. He's the president of Lytton Bionetics. And anyone who's reading Len Horowitz's excellent books, AIDS and Ebola and Healing Codes for the Biological Apocalypse, will be running into this name, Lytton Bionetics. And they were tasked with developing immune systems destroyers and cancer agents. They were the head of all experiments at Fort Detrick, and they were in charge of all monkey cultures and viruses in the United States. Lytton Bionetics, Roy Ash, National Security Advisor to the United States government. Let's get back to Mr. Kissinger in 1969, what a year that was. Because during that year, in the closed-door sessions for defense appropriations hearing, Dr. MacArthur stood up and said, secretly, after 24 years of biological warfare research that was started, by the way, with the first head of that program, George Merck, the founder of Merck Pharmaceutical Company, also heavy funders of world depopulation. 24 years of biological warfare research, 76 biological warfare labs, $31 million, a lot of money in those days, that year, for these heinous weapons. He said, let's add $10 million more to the pot, and we will develop the ultimate stealth weapon, a synthetic bioagent for which no natural immunity exists. He told the Congressional Committee, we'll probably have to deliver these as a primary aerosol through the air, and will infect people inhaling this. Now, he said this can be incapacitating or lethal, depending on what brew we use and the victim's general health. Oh, he said we might have a problem. Some people might think this is genocidal. We might have a publicity problem, but we can do the job. That money was awarded. The work did go forward. And an immunodeficiency disease was perfected at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And it was tested at the Tahoe Truckee High School. And 7 of the 8 young victims there developed chronic fatigue. Now, in 1970, Robert Gallo synthesized an AIDS-like virus under this program. And 2 years later, the WHO said the best way to test these new viruses is in vaccines, particularly among siblings. And isn't it interesting that in 1977, 100 million Africans were inoculated by the WHO, who set up a very high-tech lab near Angola in the middle of the jungle, and out of the goodness of their hearts, vaccinated these folks for smallpox, for an epidemic of smallpox. But there was no epidemic of smallpox. And they contracted AIDS. A year later, the hepatitis B vaccine was given to gays in the United States in 7 major cities. And you know what happened? AIDS broke out in those cities and only those cities. And I mentioned the International Summit on Aging and the Implications for Business. Did I mention that today all 14 countries cited by Kissinger in that Memorandum 200 now have the AIDS epidemic? 5,000 people a day are dying in Africa, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, which predicts that AIDS will be bigger in Asia even than Africa. Talking to nurses across the United States, anecdotally, we have an increase in the death rate among the elderly in hospital wards of roughly 4, 5, 6